Welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. This is Jay. In this episode, we interview Austin McCoy to discuss his piece, Disorganize the State, the Black Workers' Congress's Visions of Abolition-Democracy in the 1970s, which Austin wrote for the Labor and Employment Relations Association's publication, A Racial Reckoning in Industrial Relations, Storytelling as Revolution from Within. Austin McCoy is a historian of the 20th century United States with specializations in African American history, labor, and cultural history. He is currently working on 2 books, The Quest for Democracy, Black Power, New Left, and Progressive Politics in the Post-Industrial Midwest, and A Cultural and Personal History of De La Soul. This conversation allows us once again to return to the current of radical anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-racist labor organizing that emanated from organizations like the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, or DRUM, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and the focus of McCoy's essay, The Black Workers' Congress. In this episode, we talk about the BWC's radical vision, which McCoy describes in the tradition of what W.E.B. Du Bois called abolition-democracy, and we discuss some of the organizing history of the various individuals and organizations associated with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, as well as what happened to their vision over time. We recorded this discussion on December 18th of 2023. So it's almost a year old, and while we discuss the solidarity that these revolutionary black workers had with Palestinians, as we also discuss the UAW ceasefire call and the proposal to examine divestment, there are some important notes to add as we release this discussion almost a year later, a delay which is entirely my fault. The UAW has endorsed Kamala Harris despite her role in the genocide of Palestinians and her refusal to call for an arms embargo. And the UAW did that with no concessions whatsoever on that issue. This, in many ways, reflects the very currents of racist and imperialist union organizing that groups like the League and the BWC were organizing against. So, while we can talk about the folks within the UAW who organized for those statements and resolutions within their union as operating within the traditions we discuss in this episode, it is important to note, at least in my view, that the UAW as a whole has ultimately shunned that radical legacy once again and replicated the historical role of the labor aristocracy in this moment, as they and other major unions have done over and over again. Nonetheless, I do think that it is important not to dismiss the power or potential of labor organizing in moments like this, even if a radical vision of that potential remains unfulfilled. I think about the lessons that Stefano Harney and Fred Moten pull from people like General Baker when they called us to wildcat the totality several years ago. I'd like to send much appreciation to Austin McCoy for this discussion. If you would like to support our work, please become a patron of the show for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/millennialsarekillingcapitalism.
Before we get started with the piece, can you just say a little bit about who the Black Workers Congress was and how you got interested in this topic? And we'll get into more detail on the Black Workers Congress as we go along, but just give us the audience some idea of who they were, where they were going, and how you got interested in studying this.
Yeah, so the Black Workers Congress was an attempt to sort of create a national and international organization that was, founded by workers and activists, especially out of Detroit. So you're thinking about, Mike Hamlin, John Watson, but then also folks who weren't working in the factories like Kenneth Cockrell Sr. But then also, they linked with James Foreman, who was a, civil rights veteran, right? So he had done work with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, served as its executive director for a time. He also, collaborated with the Black Panther Party. So he moved in and out of, civil rights and Black Power organizations, in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And he really I would say, takes a provocative action at the Black Economic Development Conference in Detroit in 1969, where he called for reparations from Christian organizations, because the conference was partly sponsored by or got money from, a sort of federation of Christian groups liberal Christian groups in the United States. So this is called the Black Manifesto. So he makes this call for, hundreds of millions of dollars in reparations to be paid from Christian churches and Christian organizations to Black communities throughout the United States. And this is sort of when, Mike Hamlin sort of, invites James Foreman to sort of come to stay in Detroit more and to see what's going on, right? I mean, so in terms of my own interest in the Black Workers Congress, I'd read about them, but mostly in passing. So books like Max Elbaum's Revolution in the Air, his history of, the revolutionary left in the United States, especially after SDS breaks up and, the Black Panther Party sort of, in decline in the early 70s. This is sort of where I first encountered the organization in my reading. But in terms of sort of more immediate motivations for writing this piece, it's a tangent, right, from my academic book that I'm working on. So I'm writing a book about the history of the progressive left in the Midwest, after 1968, and sort of the ways in which you had radical, groups and activists, some of which, appear in this article, right? So folks like Ken Cockrell, how they moved from a revolutionary politics to a more sort of reformist orientation over the course of the 1970s, because you had folks, like Cockrell, and I know Herb Boyd talks about this a little bit too, in terms of Cockrell's run for city council in 1977. But you had some leftists in Detroit, at the very least, who began to run for office and win. They won political office in the city. So that's just sort of one dimension, but this sort of also focuses on other groups and activists in places like Ohio and Chicago who sort of were, either confronting the war or trying to organize around deindustrialization in the Midwest. And sort of the main thrust of this is, you have these activists and groups who, turn to a sort of more progressive but reformist sort of political orientation during the 1970s and into the 1980s. They're able to sort of win around issues related to policing in Detroit. So this is where the anti-stress campaign comes into play. Activists in Ohio, as members of the Indochina Peace Campaign, which was a group founded by Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda, they were able to sort of contribute to the building of opposition to the Vietnam War and the U.S. military sort of incursions in Southeast Asia during the early to mid 1970s as well. But when folks turned to economic justice politics, they were stymied by usually a coalition of Democrats, corporate and business leaders. In Ohio's case, Republicans obviously joined in this coalition to defeat anti-plant closing legislation in Ohio as well, right? I mean, so, the argument is, right, I mean, the progressive left in the 1970s, 1980s could, win on particular topics that were non-economic, but when it came to economic issues, capitalism, this is when you sort of would see the most, broad-based opposition to progressive movements.
That's very interesting. I mean, obviously that's still feels very relevant.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, but that I look forward to reading that when you publish that. So one of the things I'd like to start with in this text is that, you're quite clear, that the Black Workers Congress emerged amid what you call a capitalist counter-revolution. And I love that. We love that clarity of, language here of, there's all these terms that we are used to in terms of neoliberalism and deindustrialization and so on.
Yeah.
And I think those are important to understand as specific processes, but also to look at this overarching process that's going on. So talk a little bit about the dynamics of the counter-revolution that were taking place at the time that the BWC emerges. Obviously, being in Detroit is a really key site there. But, how do you understand this counter-revolution and kind of what it's responding to?
So it is multifaceted. And, in terms of the, various elements of this, right, I mean, they're both sort of, state-based, but then also embedded in capitalism. So the sort of first flank of this that, most folks are probably going to be, the most familiar with is the increased political or police and military engagement of these liberation movements in the United States and abroad. So obviously FBI's COINTELPRO or counterintelligence program is, the tip of the spear in many cases in terms of the sort of national effort to disrupt and dismantle liberation movements in the United States. Basically, what is happening is the FBI, in conjunction with law enforcement, local and state, so, whether it's like local police departments like the Detroit Police Department or state, sort of intelligence apparatus like, the Red Squads that were instituted in various states. You had this collaboration of law enforcement on various levels to basically run a counterinsurgency, campaign against the Black Panther Party, against the Students for a Democratic Society, against the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, and the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in Detroit. And, what this often entailed was the use of informants, whether it is from the FBI, whether it is from these Red Squads. And, COINTELPRO and the FBI and law enforcement sort of would infiltrate these movements and try to pit them against each other. But then also you had something that's, even more cynical happening with the FBI, whereas they are infiltrating these movements and they are sort of using it, like those who are infiltrating to, ferret resources that might help sort of, these movements accumulate more weaponry. And then they sick the local law enforcement after these movements. So in some cases, you have the FBI actually playing both sides of this. So, that is sort of like the tip of the spear, the sort of law enforcement angle. But then you also had, and this is also related to what's taking place in Detroit, this offensive from capitalists, right? I mean, so, the Chrysler Corporation has ties to the, Detroit Police Department. In one of the newsletter articles written by the Black Workers Congress, right, they talk about the ways in which Chrysler bosses could just press a button and the police would, show up, to help break up strikes, right? I mean, so you have capitalists working with police, but then you also have this offensive that's taking place nationwide. And, this is union busting, obviously capitalists being able to sort of use their control over capital itself, in terms of threatening to, shut down and move plants, right? So this is sort of one aspect of deindustrialization. You also have capitalists who are using automation or sort of using speed up, right? Like using these tactics within the workplace to keep workers degraded and keep workers from, trying to organize or trying to devote more energy to organizing. So you have these aspects. And then by the end of the 70s, you sort of culminate with this advent of concessionary bargaining, right? I mean, so, the big three, Chrysler, General Motors, Ford Motor Company are, basically forcing unions to, take less pay, less benefits, give up more, control over production as well, right? I mean, so you have, right, law enforcement, you have the capital offensive, but then at least in the late 60s, early 70s, you have a criminal executive in, Richard Nixon, right? I mean, like, personally, I would argue that, if you're going to be president, you're going to be committing crimes regardless, right? I mean, that's why there's immunity, so we sort of admit that. But in terms of Nixon's case, he seemed to, go more to the extreme in terms of, trying to use his cronies to, break into the Democratic National, headquarters, trying to, get Daniel Ellsberg's files, right? I mean, so breaking into a psychiatrist's office, so Nixon, was sort of using his executive authority to try to not just punish mainstream Democrats, but especially folks involved with the anti-war movement as well, right? I mean, so, when you have a criminalized executive, you have, this capital offensive, and then you also have, this law enforcement apparatus, right? At least operating in the United States, but then obviously CIA abroad, you sort of get these elements of, this counter-revolution. But one could also argue that this counter-revolution is sort of always present in the United States, right? I mean, because part of the jobs of law enforcement, of the, executive branch of the United States, of capitalists, is to basically try to prevent any sort of, movement towards communism and socialism. I mean, that is basically the number one job among folks who are in government and folks who are capitalists within this economic system, right? I mean, so, there might be times where, leftist and radical and revolutionary social movements, become pretty strong. But, this is also happening within a milieu that is, I would argue, sort of inherently anti-communist, inherently anti-leftist, inherently racist, patriarchal, settler colonial.
Right on. We would agree, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So just some background, we've had other discussions specifically that people can listen to get some understanding of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the era that they came together, like the 2-part episode we did with Herb Boyd, for example, a few years ago. And of course, you can also read Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, which is an absolute must read. So we won't be able to get to a detailed history of that period and in the League today. But can you give folks a little bit of a sketch of what Drum was, what the League was, and just go into context of what the Black Workers Congress later emerges from?
Yeah, and I would also, add the documentary that the League, produced, finally got the news. It's like also a very cool piece of history that sort of, we could actually sort of see and hear folks like Ken Cockrell and John Watson explain the League's aims and, sort of their own analyses of Marxist-Leninism, of capitalism, right? I mean, so, if you could find that documentary, It's also really cool too.
Absolutely. Definitely co-sign that.
Yeah.
It's a great film.
Yeah. No, it's something that, I'll show students parts of it and they're just like, wait, who did this? And what's going on? I mean, like, that's a good way of sort of like introducing folks to the League, who may, feel like, I mean, Detroit, I Do Mind Dying is an awesome book. And I think that's one of the reasons why there hasn't been a lot written about the League still, right? I mean, because I think it's such a great book, but, the movie is also really good too. So yeah, in terms of the context, for Drum or the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, we sort of have to think about, how they came up or how they organized, more or less right after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, right? I mean, so Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th. And then, nearly a month later in May, you had, 4,000, mostly Black workers at the Dodge Hamtramck plant or Dodge, Maine, go on a wildcat strike. So they go on this wildcat strike, which is obviously sort of a, quote, illegal strike. And after the strike, Chrysler, seeks to punish, those who led it. So immediately after, right, I mean, like you had like some of the major figures of what becomes the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. So General Baker Jr., who was a worker within the plants, his colleagues who were sort of affiliated with workers, but not necessarily all working in the plants, like John Watson and Ken Cockrell. John Watson sort of comes, out of the Wayne State milieu, right? So, y'all, discuss that with Herb Boyd. And then Ken Cockrell, who also was sort of circulating in that milieu, but, is also a lawyer. Mike Hamlin, has connections as well between, to workers in the plant. So General Baker is like, sort of one of the major figures that's punished. But then you also had dozens of other Black workers who were fired and reprimanded and suspended. So what ends up happening is, you have workers who sort of develop or build the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in response to this action taken by Chrysler. What ends up happening is Drum, they release 14 demands, some of which, call for the reinstatement of workers and back pay for those who were suspended. But then they also, advocate for more radical demands. So they call for, self-determination within, the labor process for, Black workers as well, right? I mean, so this is sort of their connection to the Black Power movement. They also call for like hiring more Black foremen, superintendents, managers, doctors as well, right? I mean, so, there is this sort of, Black Power thrust that is sort of coming through in the aftermath of this strike. Obviously, Chrysler, does not respond to this. But what ends up happening is, these revolutionary union movements, especially when at Dodge, sort of, becomes more popular because there are other Black workers in plants throughout the Detroit metropolitan area who are, one, experiencing, the same types of conditions that these Black workers were experiencing. And then two, sort of looking for ways to try to organize outside the United Auto Workers structure, which, many Black workers at the time saw as racist. I mean, like one of the sort of names that they sort of give the UAW at the time is, they call it "You Ain't White," right? And sort of as a way to mock UAW's, mostly white leadership structure. So these revolutionary union movements, they spread to other, factories. I know Boyd sort of mentions this as well in terms of, the local Ford factories. UPS has one. Like, you also have a sort of health revolutionary union movement that sort of emerges in New York City as well, right? I mean, so all these revolutionary union movements, especially one in auto plants, are sort of focused on organizing Black workers in these plants. But then also with this, sort of growth of these revolutionary union movements, this is when you get Cockrell, Baker, Hamlin, and others who organize the League of Revolutionary Black Workers as a sort of umbrella group that would become the vanguard, right? I mean, for, Black working class revolution in the United States. And obviously, when you think about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers as trying to organize a vanguard, also think about the Black Panther Party as also trying to organize a vanguard. And the Black Panther Party, formed by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in 1966, organizing around what they call the lumpen proletariat, which is the Marxist term for, the folks at the very bottom of society, right? I mean, so, the quote criminal element, those who are, going to be structurally unemployed, in a, advanced industrial capitalist system, so like they're sort of focused on, their being the Black Panther Party are focused on the lumpen, whereas the League of Revolutionary Black Workers argue that the lumpen don't have much access to revolutionary organizing like the Black working class in terms of being able to organize at the point of production or within auto plants and being able to leverage that power to stop production, right? I mean, so that's sort of the League's critique, or part of the League's critique of the Black Panther Party's organizing. So the League forms late 60s, early 70s, and, it does sort of become a touchstone for those among Black and brown people who are thinking about organizing the working class in the United States.
One of the things you summarize in the piece is the series of splits and strategic disagreements coming out of Drum and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers organizing circles that led to the creation of the Black Workers Congress. So can you go over that a little bit and talk about how we get from the League to the Black Workers Congress?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the lessons, at least that I've learned when it comes to, studying the history of, leftist politics in Detroit. I mean, but obviously I think this can sort of be, expanded to studying sort of the history of the left in the United States are, right? I mean, like these ideological conflicts and these contradictions within these organizations that, end up sort of in splits or the creation of new organizations or even the demise of organizations. So within the League, what ends up happening is you begin to see, ideological splits around, should, the organization sort of lean more heavily into sort of a more Black nationalist perspective or Marxist-Leninist perspective. But then you also get a more strategic disagreement among, on the one side, you had General Baker, Marion Kramer, and other activists who were either working in the plants or affiliated more with the workers inside the plants. And then you had folks like Mike Hamlin, Ken Cockrell, John Watson, who presented an argument to organize outside of the plants more, right? I mean, so not just organize workers within, but then also organize solidarity efforts with Black folks and brown folks who weren't necessarily working in the auto industry and in factories as well, right? I mean, so you would get these schisms, and this is sort of what leads Mike Hamlin to sort of reach out to James Forman, after his declaration of the Black Manifesto, because sort of, this call for, reparations, sort of coincided with, this split in sort of, these three organizers' efforts to want to, or desires to organize outside of plants. Whereas General Baker, Marion Kramer, and others continue to organize within the plants. But as this sort of split, becomes sort of institutionalized with the creation of the Black Workers Congress and also the UAW defeating League candidates like Ron March for union office, you begin to see a slight decline within the League as a whole and within some of these drum organizations. So there's ideological splits, strategic splits. There are sort of real conflicts between the League and the UAW that the UAW win and Chrysler more or less win. That sort of, helps undermine the strength of the revolutionary union movements in Detroit and the League as a whole.
Yeah, right on. One of the things you talk about is, Ken Cockrell's orientation towards, like arrests and, discipline in terms of like the idea that, like cadre need to be kind of like disciplined and not, doing a lot of basically illegal behavior, right? And, his orientation, in some ways, I think this is, at least among parties today, like this is, I think, the kind of dominant, kind of way that people think, which is like that it provides them some protection against like COINTELPRO, right? Because if you're, obviously COINTELPRO itself was illegal and was, wasn't really that worried about what the people they were targeting were doing necessarily. But like I guess the best version of it, I feel like Ray Luke Levasseur talked about it with us once, and he was just sort of like, it's like it's not smart to be smoking pot like when you're like out organizing or whatever, because you could be arrested for that and then it gets in the way of your organizing. And so that's like an example of this, I guess, in some ways. But part of the reason I'm interested in this question is because I think that there's also this question of like, what is our orientation going to be towards the police in some sense? And understanding that, revolution itself is illegal, right? And like, that at some point there becomes a confrontation has to come at sort of some point, right? And so, that question of that, I guess. And so, whereas like on the flip side, you could have, and there was actually disagreement about this within the Panthers too, I guess. I mean, because that's how you get, not how you get, but that's one of the many things that sort of leads to the split between like the BLA and the Oakland Panthers, I guess I would say, as things proceed, is sort of whether you're going to move to operate within the bounds of what the state sort of says you can do from an organizing perspective, or whether you're going to continue to have this kind of antagonistic relationship with the police that includes violence and counter-violence, et cetera. It's a tricky problem, right? And obviously some of it's about, I think, like capacity, but also discipline and all of these things, and like defending your movements, and all of those questions. And one of the things that you show in the article, right, is that it kind of stems from this belief that the duty of revolutionaries is to remain in that position, to be able to continue to do the revolutionary activity and to be able to organize basically as best as they can. So anyways, I'm just interested in if you could share some of your thoughts on that and on kind of the orientation that the BWC took towards it, or even, the League and some of the Detroit activists and thinkers around this question.
When I first encountered this speech by Cockrell that he gives at an anti-repression conference, it sort of reminded me of, the times when we had been organizing as grad students at, in Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, especially around the police. And part of it is, going through like, okay, who could and could not get arrested, right? Like being sort of super clear about, what people's capacities were, what people's sort of legal exposure might be. But then, we weren't ever in a position, obviously, that would sort of be very threatened by the state in terms of, just depopulating our organization or movement. Whereas this is sort of the exact situation that, the Panthers, the League, SDS, like all these other organizations sort of found themselves in the late 1960s, right? I mean, and, this speech obviously comes a little more than a month after the FBI collaborates with the Chicago Police Department to, assassinate Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. So, obviously, right, like repression is, really at the fore of, folks' minds in Detroit. And Cockrell is, arguing that, the first thing that a revolutionary organization should, try to avoid is becoming a defense organization. I mean, basically, what ends up happening is you end up sort of being, again, depopulated by the state, but then also you're sort of, using financial and other resources towards defending people who are in jail, right? Which, yes, would absolutely, would hamstring a movement's ability to sort of go on the offensive when it comes to issues related to challenging capitalism, challenging law enforcement, stopping war, right? I mean, like it sort of forces you into a more defensive crouch. And I think this is what Cockrell and the League were seeing with the Panthers, right? I mean, like I think they were watching the Panthers, engaging in shootouts or being engaged in shootouts by the police. And then obviously in terms of thinking about folks like Fred Hampton, who, the FBI had been, investigating and tailing and they infiltrated the Illinois Panthers and they were able to help the Chicago Police Department arrest Hampton on minor offenses, right? I mean, like this is sort of how they would try to get people in jail, or at least with Huey P. Newton's case, I mean, it was like, he was involved in a shootout and that sort of allowed the Oakland Police Department to sort of, incarcerate him for a time being. And even when the charges were dropped, he stayed in jail. It was like he was not, released immediately. Eldridge Cleaver, right? I mean, like he was supposed to report to serve. He has to flee. Bobby Seale sort of hemmed up in the Chicago 8 case, right? I mean, like, so you have folks who are watching, at this point, the sort of most powerful radical Black political organization in the United States having to sort of, fend for itself with many of its leaders at one point either jailed, exiled, or in court, right? I mean, so when you sort of are seeing this, but then also seeing other members in other chapters who are, going to trial, it's okay. So what are the Panthers? What are they able to accomplish besides sort of grow in response to at least Huey Newton's incarceration and the Free Huey movement? And I think this even leads Newton to a degree to sort of, okay, let's sort of at least retreat back to Oakland, focus on survival programs a little more rather than, sort of explicitly opposing police brutality or at least engaging the police with guns, right? I mean, so I think there's even a shift of thinking with Newton, but then I think with Cockrell, on the one hand, I also think part of it is he's a lawyer, right? I mean, so like he's thinking about the legal vulnerability of folks that he is working with. He has successfully defended, workers who have shot and killed their bosses as well as other activists in the community. So I think there's also some of this legal expertise that he's trying to bring to the movement that is, actually, if we want to sort of be focused on transforming the city and transforming society, we can't be in court all the time, unless we're going to be the ones who are suing, corporations or suing the prosecutor or suing the police department for their wrongdoing, right? I mean, like if we're going to be doing legal work, it needs to be on the offensive, or it needs to be in a way that we can take things to be on the offensive. So I think this is also where he begins to sort of drop some hints about what the movement should try to achieve in terms of taking control over the city. And this is sort of like something that he talks about a little late 60s, but sort of this begins to pick up in the early 1970s as well. So, yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it seems, when I read it, seems somewhat, individualistic and sort of a behavioral analysis. But then on the other hand, there is a strategic point to it in terms of, how does one in a revolutionary organization or radical organization be able to, mount its own offensive against the state and against capitalism?
Okay, I appreciate that. It's also interesting, I think, and you kind of lay this out in the piece, how the Black Workers Congress, is also working kind of in the same time frame as the Panthers also kind of shift to this united front against fascism, kind of strategy or orientation. And there's convenings that are related to the United Front against fascism. And then obviously there's the Black Workers Congress. You kind of look at some of these things side by side. And so just talk about them, I guess, in orientation to each other and some of the things that you see as kind of the key similarities or, differences in the platforms and the orientation. I'm also, just as a minor point, I'm also curious to the degree it seems like they would have been aware of each other. I mean, I know that there was even, I can't remember if I think it's John Watson who was briefly in both the Panthers and the League, and then they said you can't like be in both basically, and so he went to the League. But yeah, so anyway,
right. Yeah. I mean, the rivalry between the League and the Detroit Panthers, was rather real in that regard. And yeah, I think in terms of the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention, that the Black Panther Party, helped organize. This was, their effort at trying to build a very broad popular front against fascism. So like the Black Workers Congress also used, they also described what's taking place in the United States in the early 1970s as fascism. Members of the Black Panther Party, like you'll see this in the Black Panther newspaper. George Jackson writes about this in Blood in My Eye. So like you have Black folks, brown folks who are sort of operating in the United States operating on the left of the United States, who are beginning to sort of envision, this effort towards disrupting revolutionary liberation movements in the United States and abroad as part of a sort of fascist front. So this is the opposition to this, right? I mean, and this would be multinational, multiracial. This involved, for the Panthers, incorporating, white radical activists as well. And no, they came together to sort of build a constitution that was grounded in revolutionary principles. And this constitution would be, anti-capitalist. It would be internationalist and anti-imperialist. And with this taking place, the BWC, they produced their own manifesto that is also sort of using this language in terms of, trying to eradicate the carceral state, the warfare state, obviously abolishing capitalism, but the Black Workers Congress is ironically a smaller endeavor in terms of like it's the convention that it had to sort of, announce its founding and its sort of membership in comparison to this People's Constitutional Convention that the Panthers organized. And what ends up happening with, obviously with both of these cases, and I think this is sort of where when you're living in a reactionary society, like a lot of these efforts become what ifs, and both of these, become what ifs, because after the convention, the Panthers do organize, these national committees against fascism. And Joshua Bloom and Waldo Martin, they discuss this in Black Against Empire. And, these committees are, sort of instituted in places where there are Panther chapters throughout the United States. And this was supposed to sort of carry on this effort towards, sort of building an anti-fascist front. But again, like due to the sort of intense pressure that law enforcement put the Panthers in, this was one of the efforts that was abandoned by Newton and the Panthers soon after, right? I mean, so between that, obviously the dissolution of, the Students for a Democratic Society also sort of contributed to this as well. So, that's a what if. And then obviously the Black Workers Congress, in terms of it producing its own manifesto, is also a what if. And because, when thinking about this 1970 repression conference that Cockrell spoke at, it seemed to be a one-off affair in terms of, responding to what Chicago Police Department and FBI, how they assassinated Hampton and Clark. And then, you have there's like a sort of gap between this conference where Cockrell makes a speech and the institution of the Black Workers Congress and the production of their manifesto that is sort of more full-throatedly anti-fascist.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of mentioned this like in passing about the manifesto. What was ultimately the vision that the Black Workers Congress laid out and articulated in it? And what were some of the internal and public-facing documents?
Yeah, I mean, so this manifesto, like I would describe it as, abolitionist and democratic. I mean, even in the sort of tradition of Angela Davis, but then also Ruth Wilson Gilmore, folks who have been drawing from W.B. Du Bois's, thoughts around abolitionist democracy that he outlines in Black Reconstruction, right? This idea of dismantling systems of oppression in Du Bois's, analysis. This would be enslavement and racism, but then also the creation of a society grounded in more sort of democratic, with a small d, very democratic principles, right? I mean, so this included the, at least in his analysis, the building up of institutions that would, help sort of enable, Black folks to have more self-determination after the Civil War, or even sort of help incorporate Black folks into, at the very least, U.S. citizenship, right? I mean, so like he sort of takes the Freedmen's Bureau in its most sort of idealistic form as one potential example of this, right? I mean, and this is a Freedmen's Bureau that would sort of work, on behalf of Black folks, not sort of the Freedmen's Bureau that sort of, ends up being created. So this is the idea, right, of abolition democracy, right? Dismantling oppressive, violent institutions, but then also setting up institutions that give people more democratic or enables more democratic participation, can enable systems of racial, gender, justice, worker liberation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would sort of that's how I would categorize this manifesto, right? So it's 32 points, which on the one hand is very long, right? I mean, so, something, I talk to my students about when I teach the Panthers is that, one of the sort of rhetorical strengths of the Black Panther Party platform is that it was 10 points. And, with it being 10 points, they were 10 points that could be grasped pretty quickly by people or could fit on a single sheet of paper. The 32-point manifesto, very comprehensive for the Black Workers Congress. And, they distributed drafts, of course, throughout the other chapters, but they were able to sort of, print these flyers up that would, list these points, mostly without any sort of explanation, and they could distribute these as flyers as well. But so it was public facing in that regard. They also published it in their sort of, I think, their only issue. Either they had one or a few issues of Siege, which was their newspaper. So they published it in their first issue of Siege. And this manifesto calls for the abolition of capitalism, the carceral state, the warfare state. The first point of it and their objectives is, the fight for workers' control over the means of production. The manifesto calls for the elimination of patriarchy. There are some, social democratic aspects to this in terms of calling for, free childcare, free healthcare, free education. There are aspects that are, related to environmental justice, which calling for the curbing of pollution by corporations and capitalists. But then there are some internationalist and anti-imperialist calls, right? I mean, so reparations for, quote, people of Africa, Latin America, and Asia, U.S. divestment from South Africa. But then they also call for, and I am going to quote this because I think it's important, the right of the Palestinian people to their homeland for the Middle East, right? So that's a direct quote from the, Black Workers Congress manifesto. And then it all sort of culminates, with the 32nd point, call for, basically an international state that will be collectively planned, right? An international state / economy that's collectively planned by the workers, right? I mean, so again, there's a lot of stuff in this 32-point document, which on the one hand makes it very, very comprehensive, but then on the other hand, it sort of can sort of make you think about, okay, what would the strategy be in terms of implementing all of this?
Yeah, and that kind of was our next question. I mean, I think that's one of the things that, is probably not that articulated, so maybe this is a bit of a speculative question, but one distinction that you draw, right, is that, Panthers with the United Front Against Fascism, like one of their demands was around community control of police. Like that, we've seen that actually discussion emerge a little bit in recent years too, with like these questions about whether defund as a demand actually gets you closer to abolition, or if it's just something that can very easily be like, if it's done, it could be taken away or it can be shifted. I think people can play games with budgets, but ultimately, are we able to actually vote away the police, right? Given their structural function within our society, right? But they're thinking about these things. They're thinking about, a society without all these levels of policing and carceral and military structure. But they're also really importantly centering like worker control over the means of production, right? And this is something, I mean, comes through in the League, with their politics and their orientation. And interestingly, there's kind of some interesting, I think, relationships between like the movements in Italy and like Turin, I think it is, and like the League also, both really thinking about worker control and democratic workplaces and stuff like that. So, I don't know. I mean, it sounds like there isn't a clear sort of theory of transition that's articulated in these documents. But that's sort of the question that it comes up for me, is sort of a strategy or a theory,
right?
And maybe they don't get to that point, and that's fine. I mean, it's great as a visionary document. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, this is sort of where we encounter this. I wouldn't even call it necessarily even a contradiction, because again, I think the point of, living in a system that is within the United States, right? This sort of, this capitalist system is to thwart any sort of efforts to try to operationalize, any sort of radical, vision, right? I mean, that is the point. So the fact that BWC can, articulate a 32-point document, but then also, I mean, we probably know plenty of other activists, operating right now who, produce these awesome visions. And then, the question sometimes will become, well, why can they operationalize this? And it's like, well, because the police, the state, right, capitalists have been trying to thwart that. This has like been the mission of the United States for as long as industrial capitalism and settler colonialism has been operating in North America, right? I mean, so on the one hand, we had these visions, but then on the other hand, the question becomes, right, like you've been mentioning, right, like, so how does one get here? Cockrell, again, I think articulates some hints, like, I mean, when it comes to either his 1970, speech about repression in terms of taking state power, which sort of is obviously in line with, Marxist-Leninism in terms of, creating a vanguard party and sort of trying to create revolutionary conditions to the point to where one can destabilize society enough to where the vanguard party can then take control over the state. Because, I mean, I think we both can agree that we are at the very least very, very far away from the idea of someone voting in the leftist vanguard party in the United States, right? I mean, like, that's the most generous sort of forecast, let alone like, no, it's going to be something like a vanguard, like the vanguard party, the Bolshevik party took control amid a revolution, right? I mean, like, that's the point, right? I mean, and I think that was the point for, the League, but even the Black Panther Party, if they were to sort of ever get to this point, right? So for Cockrell, it was like take control of state power. But when it comes to doing this, then it became, well, operating within the confines of established politics. And that meant electoral politics, in Detroit and in the United States. And in Detroit, the conditions were at least ripe for, Black folks to take, control over City Hall and to sort of continue to have majorities on City Council. And maybe from there, one could sort of have influence over the police department. But as we know from the history of Black mayors, especially after the 1960s, if we read folks like even Adolph Reed Jr., like, this was very, very, very tenuous at best, right? I mean, like, what ends up happening is, Black mayors, they win and then they become beholden. If they don't just totally embrace, the business and corporate and real estate interests within their own cities, right? I mean, they become beholden to, private capital, more or less. And then they also become beholden to a degree to law enforcement because, they often engage in struggles to try to even reform law enforcement. So, Cockrell's ideas of taking control over the state, and it would be through electoral politics, right, had its own obvious contradictions. They would pursue this line, as they sort of participated in the anti-stress movement in the early 1970s. And you would get Justin Ravitz, who was a white Marxist lawyer who would run for Recorder's Court judge in 1972 as a Marxist, and he would win a seat, on Recorder's Court. Ken Cockrell would run as an independent socialist. He ran for, city council in 1977, and he won, but the limits to this would be, these would be the only leftists, at least those who were sort of, positioning themselves as Marxists and socialists, who would sort of win, and then they would sort of be just outnumbered, more or less, by, Black liberals within the city. And then obviously by the time Cockrell runs for, city council in 77, Coleman Young has already consolidated power and has built his own political machine, right? I mean, so, again, Cockrell and this sort of faction of leftists in Detroit were sort of, again, going to be working uphill in terms of trying to achieve power. So it's the sort of age-old contradiction when it comes to leftist politics in the United States between, visionary, ideas and plans, but then also not necessarily having either the grassroots support to build power to sort of put people in positions to implement these visions, or even, not being able to sort of mount any sort of disruptive opposition that could destabilize, one's surroundings or environment enough to then sort of take power. But I think, again, that is part of us living in a reactionary country.
Yeah. So why do you think the Black Workers Congress didn't find more success in building a base around this platform? What were some of the factors within society and the factors within the group that limit their success?
Yeah. So the BWC, it doesn't last very long. I mean, and if you think about, right, from 1968, when drum sort of comes onto the scene, and then like a couple years later, you had, or like soon after, you have the league that forms. And then sort of like right after that, the BWC is formed, right? I mean, like you have sort of this sort of quick succession of worker organizations that is sort of, on the one hand, like responding very well to conditions in terms of at least inspiring more organizing and inspiring the creation of more visionary demands and plans for social transformation. But then also you have these obviously you have these ideological, political, and sometimes personality conflicts among, these groups. So when it comes to the BWC, you have a couple of things going on at the same time. So on the one hand, you have some, strategic and personality conflicts among, James Foreman, and then also Ken Cockrell and John Watson and Mike Hamlin. Hamlin stays in the longest, but they end up expelling James Foreman because, their arguments are, this guy seems really only be focused on empowering himself, right? I mean, like he is not, like they have not sort of created an organization that would sort of respond to, at the very least, he would be able to respond to critiques of his own leadership. And, Cockrell would be, one who would sort of become very frustrated with Foreman. And we have to also keep in mind that Cockrell is also a very charismatic individual as well. So, when you have someone who is, people are talking about being a potential mayoral candidate for Detroit and Cockrell, and then you also have James Foreman in the organization who has been able to sort of organize groups like, the BWC, also sort of, mount a call for reparations through the Black Manifesto, but then also he has taken trips abroad and, to play like China, Vietnam and other places, sort of trying to sort of build relationships with folks outside of the United States. There might be some friction in terms of personality, but a lot of it does come down to strategy, right? I mean, like how should the organization seek to, build itself up to a point where it can sort of actually represent working class people and working class people of color throughout the United States. And yeah, like Foreman, was sort of focused on the international aspects of it. Those in Detroit were sort of beginning to sort of turn their focus more towards what was happening in the city. And then eventually John Watson, walks away from the group due to burnout. Cockrell, goes his own way and sort of gets more involved in the anti-police struggle in the city. Hamlin sort of hangs on as, part of the BWC, but by the mid-1970s, the organization is a shell of itself. So, you have these internal contradictions in terms of strategy, personality, but what, individual leaders want to focus on for themselves. But then also you have, Black workers becoming more incorporated into the UAW, which I think at the same time also depletes the league as well. So, the UAW begins to sort of, have, more Black folks ascend in its ranks. And that sort of, takes some of the bite out of the, revolutionary union movements that are taking place as well. So you have that, but then also, right, I mean, you have economic crisis. And so you have the oil embargo starting in 1974, which leads to an energy crisis, which then also, helps contribute to recession, which then also helps contribute to layoffs, especially in the Detroit metropolitan area, which is then sort of depleting not just UAW members, but also Black workers who would consider themselves part of the industrial working class struggles of an organization like the BWC.
Yeah, thanks. Let's talk a little bit about stress. So this is, I forget, you can remind us what the acronym is, but this is a key anti-policing struggle. Obviously, it comes after also the Detroit rebellions, we're years later now, but this becomes a big organizing focus. It's something that also, is discussed in Detroit, I Do Mind Dying too.
Yeah.
And obviously it reminds us in many ways of struggles against police violence and certain kind of, police tactics or, like stop and frisk, like that kind of, thing that they're ongoing within, not within the Black community, but targeting the Black community. Right. And your article, through this campaign, in some ways that this also kind of, and you kind of laid this out just now, but it sort of was in one way a contributing factor, I guess, to the fracturing of the BWC, if I understand kind of how you're laying it out. But so just talk a little bit about what it was, and maybe, I guess the question is partly like, is it a campaign that takes on so much momentum that it draws activists into its orbit away from other forms of working class organizing, is part of what I was thinking about with this question,
Yeah, I think that is very much the case. So STRESS, the acronym is Stop the Robberies, Enjoy Safe Streets. And this was a clandestine police unit that was formally instituted in January 1971, but obviously the development of it had been taking place at least since the fall of 1970. And this is sort of, the Detroit Police Department, but then also, Mayor Roman Gribbs, who was also formerly a, sheriff deputy. Like, this was sort of their efforts at, try to quote unquote clean up downtown and to sort of create conditions for, more real estate and business and corporate development. So obviously this is one of those situations where, the creation of sort of new, quote unquote, specialized police units and downtown development sort of go hand in hand. And this police unit forms in 1971. And, through sort of a congressional hearing, folks would learn that it started with around 100 police officers, and they would sort of go around in 4-person teams. And basically they would engage, quote unquote, suspicious pedestrians, right? I mean, so what this amounts to is this unit specialized in entrapment, right? I mean, so they would have folks who would go in undercover, and they would at times accost people who they thought, seemed like they might be, quote unquote, criminal. And through these interactions, they would turn violent because the police would shoot and kill them, right? I mean, and what ends up happening is in September 1971, members of this unit engage a couple of Black teenagers. One of the members of the unit is walking down the street. He appears to be, quote unquote, drunk. And one teenager sort of approaches him, asks, what are you doing? Or where are you going? Are you lost? And then according to the police report, one of the teenagers tries to go for this person's watch. Then a scuffle ensues. And then the police officer draws their weapon, and the 2 teenagers flee, and he shoots them both in the back. And then, out of this, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office declares that the shooting was justified, and the killings of these 2 teenagers, in September 1971, these would sort of be among the 10 people that were killed by this unit alone since its institution in January 1971. So STRESS actually killed 5 Black Detroiters in that month alone. So as one can imagine, right, I mean, like this sort of generates widespread outrage, and it generates a broad-based movement of, you had, liberal folks and groups like, so Coleman Young was, sort of like involved on the sort of margins, but then you had the local NAACP. Detroit had a chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that, emerged as part of the opposition. You had this business/liberal political organization called the New Detroit Incorporated, which was created after the uprising in 1967, with much of it being white leadership led. You had, that organization that sort of spoke out against this, but then radical groups and radical activists, right? I mean, so the Republic for New Africa obviously opposed stress. You have folks like Ken Cockrell and, Justin Ravitz, who were also part of another organization called the Legal Defense Coalition. You had white leftists like the Motor City Labor League, so you had this broad-based movement that, arose to, for some, they wanted to reform stress, right? I mean, so they wanted stress to, be one, a little more diversified, two, to sort of, make sure officers underwent psychiatric evaluation, but then you also had radicals who were calling for its abolition at the beginning. And what ends up happening is there's a turning point, and this turning point is the stress officers, or some of the stress officers, engage in a shootout with Wayne County sheriffs, right? I mean, so you have a shootout between two law enforcement agencies where stress was sort of staking out an apartment. They saw a couple people go in. They suspected that it might have been a place that was sort of related to drug activity. They go in, and what ends up happening is they're interrupting a poker game, but stress officers go in with guns blazing, and multiple people are dead and injured as a result. And this sort of leads liberals to even say, oh, this unit has to be abolished. So, what ends up happening is, like, you have liberals move from a reform to an abolished position on stress. And then you begin to see a lot more pressure being put on the police commissioner, John Nichols, as well as the mayor, as well as the Wayne County prosecutor. So, the Legal Defense Coalition, they try to sue stress to get more information about the unit, but they, Cockrell and Ravitz were unsuccessful. But this also leads Ravitz to, run for office, right? I mean, so this is where the conversations around taking control over institutions not only begin to intensify, but they also begin to become, they begin to be operationalized within the movement. So like Ravitz, again, he runs for Recorder's Court judge, wins, and this sort of movement is also fueling Coleman Young's, emergence as a mayoral candidate in the mayoral election in 1973. Cockrell is also, rumored to be a candidate and to be a strong candidate. But Cockrell pulls out because one of the philosophies around electoral politics that folks within this cadre of leftists, white leftists and black leftists in Detroit sort of develop is, we're not going to run for office just to protest. We're going to run if we can win. That was their philosophy. And Cockrell was sort of following that philosophy within the movement. So he decides not to run. So then this sets up a mayoral contest between Coleman Young and the police commissioner. So the police commissioner throughout all this decides that he's also going to run for mayor, and Coleman Young defeats him. And amid all of this, you also have the intensification of the movement because stress officers engaged in another shootout with three other anti-drug activists, black anti-drug activists. And the black anti-drug activists, they kill one of the stress officers, and this sets off this massive manhunt that has Detroit Police Department officers basically invading black people's houses throughout the community, ransacking them. And this sort of galvanates more black folks in the community to say that stress has to go, right? I mean, so part of the issue with this is, Cockrell and others were able to participate in a sort of broad-based movement that was citywide. They articulated their own sort of radical critiques of stress, sort of linking it to obviously like an anti-capitalist analysis, right? The police and developers working in cahoots to basically ensure that, real estate developers, business leaders, and businesses are able to profit while sort of sort of oppressing Black people, but they also sort of connected to, what's happening on a national level in terms of, envisioning as part of this broader criminality of the state in terms of even Richard Nixon's, Watergate crimes, right? I mean, so like they're sort of, putting together this broad analysis of state power that's criminal, in their words. So, you have all this going on. So you have this intellectual piece, you have this sort of social movement piece, oppositional piece that was stirred a lot by the police themselves, of course. And then, out of this sort of comes an electoral focus that Cockrell again sort of takes into the late 1970s.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, one of the things you're looking at here that, and you've already sort of outlined why and everything else, but that hasn't really fully reconnected, and I even hesitated to use that term because it's not as though there's ever been a dominant strand of working class politics within the United States that is also anti-imperialist and anti-racist, right? We don't really have that history. And I mean, the U.S. is special in that regard, I guess, but it also is true among a lot of European Union politics and things like that it often centers around what is perceived as best for the kind of, quote unquote, national working class. Right. But, what's interesting, I think, about this history and about the League, but also the BWC is this vision to connect those things together, and that it is operating within working, among workers, but also thinking clearly about the working class. Because I think that there's been especially with the New Left and a lot of politics since then, there has been this, I think, tendency to move away sometimes from organizing the workplace or thinking about the workplace as the site of organization for those anti-imperialist politics and stuff. So, you get more, kind of student organizing around that, or, public facing discussion around it, but it's not necessarily connected to, movements that are attempting to really directly speak to components of the working class. So I guess one of the things to say is that, in that period, obviously, this was still kind of a marginalized position within working politics, but it was also an attempt to create a vision around that and to think about organizing in those spheres. And, we see a kind of resurgence. We've lived, I think, over a kind of weak point over the last 40 years or so of, so-called working class ability to organize, to win demands, to win their campaigns and their strikes and things like that. And we've seen some return of that kind of working class militancy in the last few years. And we have seen some examples, I think, of, like the thing that came to mind as I was thinking about this question is even talking about the UAW. Recently they, obviously issued a statement for a ceasefire, but also said that they were going to do investigations basically around divestment to try to see if there's ways that they could support or pressure, Israel. I don't know exactly what their aims are there or how they fully see the struggle, but nonetheless, like thinking about their own relationship to, Israel and apartheid there and stuff like that. And so anyway, I wanted to give you space to sort of talk about, whether you see opportunities or examples of groups beginning to reconnect these politics, or if you wanted to talk about, sort of why they're important to connect from your point of view.
Yeah. Because I think you're right in terms of the UAW example, as being sort of obviously not just the most recent, but potentially, one of the more significant examples that we've seen. Because, we think about the history of the AFL-CIO. Their history is sordid at best in terms of George Meany and, whether it's like his leadership, sort of like being pro-war, but then also, the AFL-CIO's sort of relationship with, the CIA, right? It's like, AFL-CIO is not the place, one is going to look, but then having a sort of national, international labor organization that's sort of been a staple in, U.S. politics, like the UAW sort of coming out for ceasefire, but then also, we're going to sort of investigate investigate the history of, sort of our relationship to, what's taken place in Israel and Palestine is very important, and I think, they were also sort of joining other unions as well and sort of this call for ceasefires, so, it's, in many ways, right? I mean, like this is sort of part of this tradition that of the sort of BWC, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, right? I mean, like whether it is like Black workers sort of, paying attention to what's taking place in the Middle East, so again, like one of BWC's points was, calling for, the liberation of Palestine and solidarity with Palestinians, this is part of this longer tradition that goes back to the International Workers of the World, right? And sort of, expressing solidarity with workers abroad. So I think, one of the important lessons of the BWC, especially for right now, is, their ability to, on the one hand, they're not necessarily calling for, workers abroad to sort of abandon nationalism, but they are calling for workers within the United States to sort of, build solidarity with workers abroad and sort of build solidarity in opposition to U.S. imperialism and U.S. empire. So, that is one lesson, but they're not just sort of picking places in groups of workers, sort of like out of political convenience, right? I mean, like they are sort of, all the workers in quote, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, in their first edition of Siege, like they publish an article that discusses what's taken place in Palestine and Israel. And they, amplify, the calls for the, liberation of Palestine for, everyone to live in that area, right? I mean, so it's not sort of a call to, eliminate groups of people, but, to create a space where everyone, from any religious and ethnic background, could live together, right? I mean, like that's sort of the thing that often gets lost, right? I mean, I think it gets lost today because there are this very, there's a very intense, devotion. There's always been an intense devotion to nationalism, but it seems to be, the intensity has very much picked up, since 2014, 2015 in terms of, right-wing nationalists sort of, trying to take power in the United States, throughout Europe and abroad and, elsewhere. So, it's sort of convenient for right-wing nationalists, for, liberals who are also nationalists to sort of join in their cause when it comes at least to what's taking place in Israel and Palestine and, Gaza, West Bank today, right? I mean, and I think that's one of the warnings that groups like BWC, the Black Panthers, are trying to issue, is that don't get caught in this trap. Don't get caught in the trap of nationalism, especially if you are living in a settler colonial state, right? Especially, right? I mean, there's a difference between living in a settler colonial state and sort of, advocating for a nationalism of a political majority. And, there's a difference between that and folks who are struggling, against settler colonialism, who might be organizing around ethnicity, religion, et cetera. But, but there's still another sort of level to go in terms of building international solidarity, because that is sort of where the visions of folks who want to liberate territories, that's the direction that they're pointing towards, right? I mean, it's not about eliminating groups of people. It's about trying to find ways to build a society, economically, socially, culturally, that on the one hand is going to be diverse, but then on the other hand, where folks can sort of cooperate in sort of building institutions or communities that can sort of take care of everyone. So, the UAW sort of, and folks are calling for a ceasefire, like, that's sort of the direction that, folks are going. That's the sort of horizon that people are pointing to. What would be great to see more of is like, again, more sort of labor organizations, so I know Starbucks United, has like also done this as well, sort of called for a ceasefire, to the point to where like, Starbucks, like the bosses are trying to sue them over, this as well, claiming that the union is more or less giving Starbucks a bad name, which is like, I don't know how that's possible. How can, the workers in the union give, a corporation a worse name than the bosses. Right. But, like this is sort of where some of these workers, and some of these industries are pointing towards, And I think what will be important is sort of articulating the meaning of what it means to either call for a ceasefire in what's taken place, or even what's the meaning behind engaging in international solidarity. Because, I don't think that we have this conversation enough, especially in mainstream, right? It becomes, this sort of Manichaean binary, you got to support the terrorists or you don't, and it's like, that's not what's happening here. This is how you all are framing it. So then you can sort of you can force people to sort of participate in this false binary, so what does it mean, right? I mean, what does it mean, to call for a ceasefire, to call for international solidarity? And part of that to me means that, you're trying to transform territories and spaces and communities into places where everyone can sort of be able to participate democratically at the very, 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 very least. So I think that's the lesson that I take, right? I mean, like, obviously, I'm not a member of the UAW. I'm not, part of one of these major labor organizations, but it's sort of the hope that I get from when I think about Black Workers Congress, League of Revolutionary Black Workers, even the Black Panthers or other sort of anti-imperialist forces and organizations that, have been operating, but then also extending into our day. I think, you have folks who, been working within, the sort of Black Lives Matter movement, who have also been articulating these same positions as it relates to Palestine and Israel as well, right? I mean, the call for, dismantling of any sort of remnants of segregation, institutionalized segregation based upon religion, ethnicity and nationality, and sort of a historical heritage. If we're going to base our history of the United States, or ground some of that in the civil rights movement here and the struggles against Jim Crow here, folks like Mark Lamont Hill, but even folks recently like Ta-Nehisi Coates are also arguing that we should, apply that same, lesson to what's taken place in Palestine.
Appreciate that. The last thing I did actually just want to ask you is, like, thinking about this piece, I can't remember, you wrote it, when did you write this?
This piece, like, I wrote it, so it came out last year or this past year. This past year. Yeah.
I mean, it also made me think too about, I think there's this interesting back and forth, not in an antagonistic way, but just as movements, as younger movements of the last, decade or so, try to figure out different ways to be effective and to organize and think. Obviously, we've seen multiple phases of the Black Lives Matter, movement or movement for Black lives. And, you're correct, I think, in pointing out that, like, they do often have these articulations that touch on a lot of similar things in terms of, like, worker power, working class demands, international demands as well, right? It's a holistic vision often. But we've also seen that, like, a lot of the protest movements and things like that, like, if they do get gains, like, it's very easy for these gains to be like move back or whatever. And, I thought it was interesting that in that time period that you would also intervene to think about, like, Black working class politics, as we're also seeing what I would say is that kind of after Floyd, you do see, and some of this I think is related to COVID, there's a variety of different things that are going on, but you see, I feel like in that moment, more than of an uptick of, like, unionizing activity, new unions being formed, independent unions being formed, strikes happening. And so I think in some ways, like, I've read that a little bit of people saying, like, look, at least we can organize our workplace and fight here. And that's, I think, an important lesson in building collective power, but also the importance of economic demands, because as we've seen so often, like, so much of institutional racism and all of that, within our society, or racial capitalism, right, would be a better way probably to even articulate it. Obviously, there's so many aspects of that, but a huge one is the economics of it, right? And the oppression of, basically systemic poverty, which is a structural part of capitalism, of course. But So I don't know. I mean, this is not really a question. It's more of like an observation or whatever, but I'm interested in kind of, were you thinking about these things together somewhat as well? Because this piece draws a lot of those types of politics into the same place. So they're kind of speaking to one another in terms of this discussion of abolition, democracy, workplace, and also abolition and policing, because it deals with that with regard to stress and everything else too.
Right. I think part of this is, coming from some, sort of personal questions I've had that are, are sort of experiential. Like when we were sort of organizing around, the police killing of Aura Rosser in Ann Arbor. Yeah, she was a 40-year-old Black woman who was killed by Ann Arbor police in November 2014. Between us sort of doing this work in the community, but then also you had Black students, before that who had been sort of organized around racial justice concerns. Our graduate employee organization, or our grad student union, GEO, they began, like they had sort of been involved, in terms of at least sending members and leaders from the union into some of these organizations, going to meetings and being willing to participate in that way. And I think that's, one of the things that got me thinking about how does all of this relate to one another, right? I mean, all of this being, racial justice, state violence in many forms. I mean, so obviously sort of responding to the local police department killing a Black woman. But then we're sort of living in a region in Michigan where ICE is very prevalent, and ICE, they're conducting raids, not just in Detroit, but you have law enforcement that are conducting raids on migrants and migrant workers in their workplaces in Ann Arbor, right? I mean, so like you had like all these things going on. And I think, it's something that I've been thinking about and trying to pay attention to, because yeah, you're right. I think, COVID sort of exacerbates, more people are thinking, wait, I'm gonna have to go work in a, once in a generation deadly pandemic, and I have no protections, and I'm not making anything, right? Like, it's like, what are we doing here? Right. I mean, so it's like, I think folks, we were sort of entering into this moment. They're also thinking about the Fight for 15 campaigns that have been taking place as well. This is, sort of the long tail of the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, right? I mean, it's like we had like all these stirrings, and then, yeah, the pandemic just exacerbates and reveals, a lot of the truths that folks on the left, have been saying and telling about the economy and about capitalism. But then also people began to experience the idea that, I might have to make a choice between living and, a more stark choice between living or surviving an illness or sort of paying rent, or, it's just like folks are like forced into these terrible choices because of the capitalist system, because of people wanting to continue to make people work during a deadly pandemic. So yeah, I think it all sort of just blows up in 2020 and exposes a lot of things in terms of, policing, as, the movements had been sort of, illustrating, but then also, you have more workers who are, whether it's like folks in Bessemer, Alabama, who are, working at Amazon and like we're not like, we can't work under these conditions, right? I mean, like we cannot work under these conditions. Starbucks workers, the workers on, airplanes threatening to also strike, which would sort of hem up the, airplane travel, dock workers, right? I mean, so like, yeah, I think you're right. So like, as all these crises are coming to a head in 2020, you begin to have people who are sort of realizing they can organize their workplaces, but that their workplaces are very important nodes of capitalism, where it's like, people are sort of realizing that actually leverage comes from being able to sort of stop production, stop transportation, stop distribution, stop sort of business as usual. And then we all sort of watched George Floyd be murdered. And it was like, well, there has to be these connections as well, right? Like there has to be a connection between law enforcement protecting capitalism, because he was killed under suspicion of, passing counterfeit bills, right? I mean, like that is policing capitalism, almost literally, right?
Right.
So it's like we see these connections, that's what sort of generates another sort of impromptu strike by, the GEO organization, at my alma mater that summer, right, around abolitionist principles. and being able to incorporate these principles into their platform, which, that was more radical than what they were doing when they even started incorporating racial justice principles while I was a grad student there, right? I mean, so like, I think the best unions and the best worker organizations are sort of doing a great job of paying attention to everything that's happening, and not just thinking through the contours of the contract, and sort of then beginning to sort of respond to all of these things. Because when it's time for workers to go on strike, even if they're striking around their contract, they know that they must have community buy-in, participation, and organizing in order to sort of help sort of propel and sustain a strike as well, right? I mean, so like, we're sort of beginning, like we've been seeing a realization of real intellectual, ideological, and political concerns, but there are also strategic concerns as well, as in terms of, like, the more people are behind a strike, the more people are behind a union, and the more people are in a union, the more power regular people have, in comparison to or in opposition to, all of these CEOs who are just, raking in money for corporations and themselves.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thanks for the conversation, man. This has been great. Really enjoyed reading the piece and just talking to you.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. And no, I hope that we can talk sometime soon again, because I know this was great.
Absolutely. Great.
Yeah, definitely.
Bye.